Okay, let's get started. You have to bear with me today. I have a really bad sore throat I woke up with, so I'm going to try my best, but I may sound weirder than usual. Alright, so we're going to go over this from the top, okay, and then we'll get into the next step, which is going to be propagation. Alright, so we know that there is a very high concentration of sodium, okay, in the extracellular fluid, and a much lower concentration of sodium in the intracellular fluid. In comparison to potassium, there's a much higher concentration in the intracellular fluid and a much lower concentration in the extracellular fluid. We also know that there are leak gates which are found throughout the entire membrane, all the way down the axon, all the way to our terminal boutons. These leak gates are always open and allow sodium to diffuse in, while potassium is diffusing out. Problem with that is we could reach equilibrium. We can't afford to reach equilibrium because we have to have ions constantly moving in order to produce a voltage. That voltage is going to be able to open and close our voltage-regulated gates. So, in order to prevent equilibrium, we have the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, which also is found throughout our entire membrane. That pump will actively transport 3 sodium out of our neuron for every 2 potassium into the neuron. What this does is it allows for more positive charges on the outside of our membrane in comparison to the inside of our membrane, and so we have what we call a polarity across the membrane. And remember, this movement of ions in and out of the membrane generates a kinetic energy, which we measure in voltage. At rest, this kinetic energy is minus 70 millivolts, which is our resting membrane potential. Did you follow me? Okay, good. That's excellent. Then we also have in the cell membrane, found only in the dendrites and the cell body, what we would refer to as ligand-regulated gates. Now, one thing I forgot to tell you yesterday was the definition of a ligand. This is anything that binds to and opens the ligand-regulated gate. So anything that can bind to this gate and cause it to open is a ligand. So if you remember, we talked about yesterday, if this was a nociceptor, our neuron, then the ligand is enkephalin. Enkephalin is released from cells that have been damaged so that our body can know that we should be in pain. So this enkephalin is going to bind as a ligand to our ligand-regulated gates and cause those gates to open. And our ligand-regulated gates are specific only to sodium, so only sodium is able to diffuse into our neuron through these ligand-regulated gates. The number of gates opening tells us what the intensity of our response is going to be. The more ligand-regulated gates open, the more intense the response. Now, once this sodium begins to diffuse in, because there's already a high concentration of potassium inside the cell, the sodium and potassium being positively charged are going to repel each other, and we're going to see potassium beginning to move down the membrane, and our potassium will start to build up somewhere right around the axon hillock. And so you're going to start to get this buildup of potassium here. And this buildup of potassium right in this region is going to change the voltage. We're going to go from minus 70 millivolts up to minus 50 millivolts, which is our trigger voltage to start an action potential. That action potential is going to start by voltage-regulated gates opening at the axon hillock due to this change in voltage. And some sodium will diffuse in. Now you have more positive charges inside the neuron, and again, that's going to cause voltage to rise. And so maybe we go up to minus 30 millivolts now. The rise in voltage causes more sodium voltage-regulated gates to open, more sodium diffuses in, and all those positive charges inside, again, causes voltage to rise. This is a positive feedback. It continues where the voltage rises, more gates open, more sodium diffuses in, which causes the voltage to go up, and more gates open, more sodium diffuses in, which causes the voltage to go up, until we hit plus 30 millivolts. Now notice it's a plus sign, so that means there's way more positive charges inside now than outside. So we've had a reverse in our polarity, which is what we would call depolarization. So from minus 50 millivolts to plus 30 millivolts, this is depolarization. And this occurs because sodium is diffusing in to the neuron. So the upward rise of our action potential is all about sodium diffusing into the neuron. At plus 30 millivolts, we have two things happening. All our sodium voltage regulated gates close all at once, and at the same time, potassium voltage regulated gates in this area all open. So we see potassium beginning to diffuse out of our neuron, which also means, that voltage is going to drop. So we see the voltage as the potassium diffuses out dropping until we get to minus 70 millivolts. Now we have a change here at minus 70 because some of our potassium voltage regulated gates will slowly, kind of sluggishly start to close, which also means some of them stay open, so potassium can continue to diffuse out until we get all the way down to minus 90 millivolts. At minus 90 millivolts, all the potassium voltage regulated gates close. And we have no more movement of sodium, no more movement of potassium. So the only thing that is doing anything in this area is the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. And its job is to actively transport free sodium out to potassium in to try to reestablish resting membrane potential. Now, when all this potassium is diffusing out of the cell, it can actually diffuse out better than sodium can diffuse in. So you get way more positive charges outside, and you flip the polarity again. And so from plus 30 millivolts to minus 70 millivolts, since the polarity is reversed a second time, we say this is repolarization. And this again is due to potassium diffusing out of our neuron. Any questions? This is where we got to yesterday.
Did you say the sodium gates close at plus 30 millivolts?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay. propagation. Now propagation means to make more of something. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to make more action potentials. So we just started our first action potential right in this area. And we need to have more action potentials all the way down to our terminal boutons. Now here's my question for you. What was responsible for triggering the first action potential? How did we get to the trigger voltage? Say it again?
I forgot the silver leaf that chemical that binds.
Okay.
When it got to negative 50.
Okay, so we had to get to minus 50 millivolts. How did we get from minus 70 to minus 50? Potassium accumulation. So when that potassium accumulated here the first time, that's what changed us from minus 70 to minus 50. And potassium accumulation is what starts every action potential. So we have to have an accumulation of potassium here, start an action potential. Accumulation of potassium here, start an action potential. Accumulate the potassium here, get another action potential. So we're going to have to get another accumulation of potassium to get us from minus 70, which is what the membrane is right here, to minus 50 millivolts. Okay, so let's go back to what was occurring in the first action potential. Okay? So we had, from the graded response, we had an accumulation of potassium right here. And that initially opened our sodium voltage regulated gates, and our sodium started to diffuse in. Okay? Now, I didn't draw it, but you know, because we already talked about this, there's a lot of potassium, high concentration of potassium inside this neuron. So just like with the graded response, when the sodium diffuses in, the potassium ahead of it is going to repel. So when this sodium diffuses in, we see some potassium repelling down the neuron. Then more sodium diffuses in, and we're going to have more potassium repelling a little bit further down the neuron. And then more gates open, so we get more sodium diffusing in, which allows us to repel more potassium a little further down the neuron. And guess what? We're starting to accumulate potassium. This accumulation of potassium is going to allow us to get from minus 70 to minus 50 millivolts.
So I continue to set the sodium comes in and then repels the potassium all the way down the axis.
Well, not all the way. It can only repel just so far. It's kind of like, think about it this way. If I have a beach ball, okay, and I kick that beach ball, you know it's not going to go all the way around the world and hit me in the back of the head again, right? It can only go so far because there's friction and that kind of thing. Same thing inside the cell. The sodium is repelling the potassium, and it can only go so far. So it will accumulate a little distance down the neuron.
Until the next gate? Or?
Okay, so now watch. Okay, so this action potential is doing its thing. Okay, so all the sodium is coming in, and remember the upward rise here is all about sodium diffusing in. So our action potential is going up here. While that's going on, forget that one. This guy is starting to accumulate potassium, and we're going from minus 70 millivolts here, and we're rising to minus 50 millivolts. And what happens when we hit minus 50 millivolts? It's the trigger point, and the first thing that happens now in this all or nothing domino kind of thing is more voltage regulated gates will open for sodium. And now more sodium will diffuse in. And so what's happening is our voltage will start to rise. But at the same time, now watch, as this sodium diffuses in, there's potassium ahead of it, so this sodium is going to repel potassium a little distance down. We'll get more sodium diffusing in, we'll repel more potassium a little distance down the neuron. So as this sodium keeps diffusing in, you're going to get more potassium accumulating here, until eventually you'll get to the next trigger voltage. Okay, so you just sit here. Thank you. So, this first initial action potential, as it was rising, as it was going up or depolarizing, the second one was hitting minus 50. And then sodium starts to accumulate. So when this guy is repolarizing, this one here is depolarizing.
So it doesn't go all the way through depolarizing to repolarizing at the one at a time?
Yep, it's
Just
too slow.
continuous. Okay.
Too slow to do that. I mean, imagine how fast things have to move in your body. If we waited for this guy to be totally done before the next one started, it'd be way too slow. You need things to move very quickly. So, before this one's even done, the next one is starting. Before this one's even done, the next one's starting. So, the action potential behind is repolarizing, while the action potential ahead is depolarizing. And then when this one starts to repolarize, we know this one ahead will depolarize. So it's almost like you see the action potentials doing this all the way through the membrane from beginning to end. This is propagation. Any questions so far? Now, one of the big deals is, okay, with every action potential, we're repelling potassium. So we're going to have more action potential, repel potassium. Another action potential, repel potassium. Another action potential, repel potassium. Until eventually, we're going to have, at the terminal Bouton, an accumulation of potassium. Once each of those action potentials, all the way down the axon, gets that potassium to accumulate at the terminal Bouton, we're done with propagation.
Can you say that one more time, please?
Yeah. As soon as we've had all these action potentials, okay, over and over again, and we push the potassium all the way to the terminal Bouton, we're done with propagation.
When sodium diffuses the potassium at the beginning, and it pushes it, does it go all the way into the axon? Because I noticed you draw it right before.
It usually accumulates a little bit before,
Okay.
because the voltage regulated gates start at the axon hillock.
Okay.
So, some of it obviously will go further, some of it won't go as far, but on average, right around the beginning here.
Okay.
So just like you will start from the axon hillock until the Bouton.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
One action potential after the other, all the way down to the terminal Bouton. Any other questions? Okay, so then let's start secretion. In this last part, it's all about the terminal Boutons. And one of the things I want you to know is that in these terminal Boutons, we store vesicles. Now you remember, vesicles are like that phospholipid bilayer basketball-looking thing with something inside. And the something that's inside of these vesicles is a chemical that we refer to as a neurotransmitter. So we store these neurotransmitters in the vesicles in the terminal Bouton. Now, originally, the neurotransmitter is made in the cell body. And neurotransmitters are typically amino acids or protein-like structures. We make them in the cell body, package them in a vesicle, and then ship them down to the terminal Bouton where they're stored until we need it. Now, also found in the terminal Bouton are voltage-regulated gates. So we have these voltage-regulated gates throughout the terminal Bouton, but these are a different type of voltage-regulated gate They're not for sodium and they're not for potassium, they're for calcium. We have a very high concentration of calcium in the extracellular fluid. And calcium voltage regulated gates open at minus 50 millivolts. So, we've repelled this potassium all the way down to the terminal buton. And the accumulation of potassium is going to change our voltage from minus 70 to minus 50 millivolts. And that will cause our calcium voltage regulated gates to open, and calcium simply diffuses into the neuron, into our terminal buton. So at minus 50 millivolts, our calcium voltage regulated gates open, and calcium diffuses in. Now inside these terminal butons, we also have what are called transport proteins. And they do just what their name says. They transport, they move things around. But they're just kind of sitting in there, totally inactive, not doing anything, minding their own business until calcium comes along. When calcium binds to these transport proteins, they become activated. And their job is to move or to transport the vesicle to the cell membrane. Now what happens when a vesicle moves to the cell membrane? Exocytosis occurs. So what we're going to see is we're going to see this vesicle move towards the cell membrane with its neurotransmitter in it, and we're going to have exocytosis of our neurotransmitter into that synaptic cleft. Now remember, there's not much of a distance between the pre- and postsynaptic neuron. They're right next to each other. So when that neurotransmitter gets into the synaptic cleft, it now becomes the ligand for the postsynaptic neuron. So our neurotransmitter is going to bind to our ligand-regulated gates and cause those ligand-regulated gates to open, and sodium will diffuse in. And when sodium diffuses in, it repels potassium down the membrane, and potassium accumulates at the axon hillock and changes the voltage from minus 70 to minus 50 millivolts, and we start action potentials. And it all happens over again. So instead of enkephalin, like we had for our first neuron, whatever this neurotransmitter might be, there's a whole bunch of different types of neurotransmitters that we have. It will now be the ligand that stimulates the next neuron. Now, important, super important. Remember we talked about intensity. However many ligand-regulated gates opened on this first neuron has to be the exact same number that opens on the second neuron. Or we've got a problem in telling the brain what we're actually perceiving or feeling or that type of thing. So how do we make sure if there's 500 ligand-regulated gates that open on the presynaptic neuron that we'll only have 500 that open on the postsynaptic neuron? Well, we only want to release enough neurotransmitter to open only 500 gates. Now, how does this cell know exactly how much neurotransmitter to release? Nobody has a friggin' clue. Nobody's really sure. But, okay, watch this. And don't ask me to explain it because nobody's really sure how this happens either. The way that I was showing you with action potentials is that one occurs here, then we have another one, then we have another one, then we have another one. But action potentials actually go down the axon in kind of a Morse code. And so it could be, just like I showed you, 1, 1, 1, or it could be a bit different. Do you want to take a break? Or? Okay. Or it could be that you have 1, 2, 3, skip, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, and so on. And you have a totally different code. The code of action potentials appears to be what tells the neuron how much neurotransmitter to release. So a different code would release less neurotransmitter, or another code would release more neurotransmitter, so that we can change intensity of response. Now, how it does these different codes, nobody's sure. Nobody knows. So if you want to go get your PhD, study this, come back and let me know after you win the Nobel Prize, we'll be good.
That doesn't need to be in the essay, though.
No. No, it doesn't.
Oh, the code thing doesn't need
No,
to be in there?
it doesn't need to be in the essay. No. Any questions so far? Okay, last part, this does need to be in the essay. So after our neurotransmitter binds here, one of the things that's going to happen is it's going to fall off. It just does. It's not like super glued there, it falls off. And we got a problem, okay, because remember, we can only open so many gates or we'll change the code. So if this neurotransmitter falls off and binds and falls off and binds and falls off and binds, it gives us a complete different intensity of response. So once that neurotransmitter falls off, we need to get rid of it. Take it out of the area, don't let it rebind again. And since this is really important, the body actually has 3 different ways to get rid of that neurotransmitter out of the synaptic cleft. Just erase this real quick. The first way to get rid of a neurotransmitter out of the synaptic cleft is something we call reuptake. Reuptake is kind of like recycling. We're actually going to take this neurotransmitter here once it falls off, and we're going to use a pump to take the neurotransmitter and pump it back into the presynaptic neuron so we can reuse it again. So on all presynaptic neurons we have pumps that actively transport that neurotransmitter back inside. So that's one way to get the neurotransmitter out of there so it doesn't bind a second time. A second way to get rid of it is just destroy it. So hanging around in the synaptic cleft are a bunch of phagocytes that roll around and they just eat up neurotransmitter. Okay? So the second way is what we would call phagocytosis.
You said these are all ways to get rid of them.
Yep, these are all ways to remove the neurotransmitter from the synaptic cleft. Because we don't want it to bind a second time.
Where did you say the phagocytes are hanging around?
They're just in the synaptic cleft. They just hang around there all the time.
Okay.
And so they just eat up that neurotransmitter, destroy it. The third way to get rid of the neurotransmitter is not only are phagocytes hanging around in the synaptic cleft, but so are enzymes. And there are enzymes that can pull apart the neurotransmitter. And we call this enzymatic degradation. Degradation, or to degrade, means to destroy. So these enzymes are going to pull apart or destroy this neurotransmitter. And one of the things we're going to see, because it happens in multiple different places in the body, is that there are multiple different ways to do things in the body, especially if something is really important and we have to get it done. The body has multiple different mechanisms to get those chemical reactions done.
So the neurotransmitter won't rebind.
Yes, this is to keep it from rebinding and having a wrong stimulus on the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, a couple more things I want to talk about with neurotransmitters, and then we need to talk just a little bit about myelin, okay, and demyelination diseases. So, there's been a lot of speculation about neurotransmitters in the scientific community especially neurotransmitters in certain neurons in the brain. And that these neurotransmitters are what we would call feel-good neurotransmitters. They help us to feel happy and feel alert. So for instance, some of these neurotransmitters would be things like serotonin and dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine. These are basically the neurotransmitters that we find that make people feel happy. So scientists have been looking for probably the last maybe 20 years or so at a rate of depression and anxiety in the United States increasing. And so the question is, why is this happening? And then the next question is, what can we do about it? Well, I'd like to propose that there's a lot of scientific research to show that the rate of depression is increasing because we eat less fat in our diet. And the less fat we have in our diet, the less myelin sheath we have, and the more things short circuit. And so you've watched over the last 20, maybe 30 years, the levels of fat in the American diet decrease. Whereas you go to other countries and the level of fat in their diet is actually much higher, and they don't experience the same rates of depression that we have. But of course, that's not how we look at it in the United States. We just say, okay, there's tons of depression, now let's drug people up and try to, fix it that way. So they came up with a drug. This was the very first one to try to relieve depression. And this drug is referred to as an SSRI, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Okay, so now what this means is this medication turns off the pump that causes the neurotransmitter to be recycled back into the presynaptic neuron. So these pumps don't work anymore. So then what happens is this neurotransmitter will fall off and rebind, and fall off and rebind, and fall off and rebind, because it cannot go back into the presynaptic neuron due to the pump being turned off. And the idea is that the reason the person is depressed is because they don't make enough neurotransmitter to begin with. And if they don't make enough neurotransmitter, what we need to do is keep this neurotransmitter around for longer so that they get better stimulation. So allowing it to fall off and rebind, increases the intensity of the stimulation of the postsynaptic neuron. And then that should increase their ability to feel good.
Isn't that how cocaine and drugs like MDMA work? It's the exact same thing.
Yes, they
It's
do.
the exact same. That doesn't fix anything. It's just putting someone on drugs, basically. That's it.
Yeah, you are putting somebody on drugs. And no, you're not getting to the underlying problem of what's going on. That's absolutely right. So you're putting your patient on drugs because most doctors don't know what else to do. And so they just give their patient drugs. Now this first SSRI is what we would call Prozac. And so Prozac, yes, does work very similar to cocaine and MDMA, which is ecstasy, and gives the same type of effect, just obviously not as intense of an effect as those drugs. And so they're supposed to make the person feel good. Now, one of the things that everybody was told when Prozac first came out is that this drug is not addicting. We now know that is absolutely not true. Any of these types of medications that affect neurotransmitters can be addictive after a while. Remember, I told you that the neurotransmitter is originally made in the cell body. Okay, this is where it's made, and then transported and stored in the terminal bouton. Well, these drugs like Prozac and Xanax, and now we have a whole slew of different drugs like this, supposedly only affected the terminal bouton. But now we know it also affects the cell body and affects the ability over time of the person to produce neurotransmitter. So if I'm taking Prozac, let's say for 5, 10 years, and then I'm weaned off of this drug, one of the problems is that my cell body may have changed enough that I cannot produce neurotransmitter at the appropriate amount ever again. So now I have to take a drug to make me feel happy because I don't make neurotransmitter like I'm supposed to. So the longer term usage of some of these drugs that affect neurotransmitters can have permanent impact on the patient. So one of the things you really want to think about is before I put my patient on these types of drugs, is there anything else we can do? Okay, now I'm just going to give you, for instance, my daughter and I, we watched Split. Okay, I don't know if you saw that movie. It's where the guy had dual personalities, okay? And it's really interesting watching that with a psychologist, okay, who knows all about this stuff. So she's just chatting through the whole movie. And I did ask her, you know, is this really true? Because part of the movie said that one of this guy's personalities was diabetic and had to take insulin, and the other personalities weren't. So that when that personality popped out, if they needed an insulin shot at the time, they'd have to take insulin. And then another one of his personalities, he was a weightlifter. And he was able to lift hundreds of pounds, whereas the next personality couldn't lift anything. It was very weak. And she goes, that is absolutely correct. And she said that there have been a lot of studies that show that people with these, what they call DID, dual identity disorder, something like that anyway. She said that lots of studies on these people have shown that each personality actually has a different biochemistry. Now, what that tells you is I can think my way into a different physiology. So when you're giving your patients this medication, that's fine, and some people have to have it at the moment, especially if they're so depressed that they're suicidal. You may have to do this, but is this the last resort? Should you not be doing something else for them? Should you not be sending them to a really good therapist? Should you not be helping them in different ways? And of course the answer is yes, because we can actually think our way into changing our ability to secrete neurotransmitters. So, depending on the lifestyle we live, depending on the people we hang around, we can become more sad or more happy. Depending on the food we eat, we can completely change our body chemistry. It's just really, really amazing how we can do that. So by helping your patients go through therapy and do different things to try to get them to change this body chemistry is super important for them, not just relying on medication. That's not going to get to the underlying cause. It's not going to help them in the long run, and potentially could hurt them in the long run. Now, one of the other things that you have to be aware, because in California we're totally changing, and you know, we've made marijuana legal, and everybody says, oh, this drug doesn't affect you, it doesn't harm you, and I'm here to tell you that is an absolute lie. Okay? Marijuana and tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC, has the ability to change neurotransmitter levels in the brain.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
If ever in your family you have this genetics for schizophrenia,
Yes.
and then when a young man like on her like teen age using marijuana, it triggers? Does it triggers that marijuana using? Or I mean,
It can.
it can.
Yes. Because we know that THC, which is the drug in marijuana that affects the brain, can change neurotransmitter secretion, which has a big effect on schizophrenia and other mental health issues. So let me tell you, nowadays, with the types of marijuana too that we're growing, I mean, I'm sorry, God bless America. I mean, we are just entrepreneurial here in this country, okay? Not only do we have GMO corn or genetically modified peas, but we have GMO marijuana, okay? It's true. And most of the marijuana that they're selling in the marijuana stores have been genetically modified. So that if you go back to like the 50s, 60s, 70s, where you have the more natural marijuana, the percentage of THC in each joint was about 2 to 3%. Now the percentage can be anywhere from 25 to 50%, depending on what you buy. So you're talking about massive amounts of this drug hitting a person's brain. And to say that it will not affect your patient is absolutely not true. And this is why most doctors, I mean legitimate doctors, will not prescribe marijuana. Now they may prescribe certain types of drugs that are derived from marijuana, but there's no THC in it. And so you have patients who, for instance, maybe they're former drug addicts, they can't take opiates, they can't take these pain meds, and so you prescribe them what's called CBD, which is a type of drug that you get from marijuana that does not affect the brain. It does not make you high, does not change brain chemistry, but can change your perception of pain. So I have a brother who, many years ago, he was a really bad drug addict. He took speed, and good for him. He was able to get off. He's been off of it for over 20 years now, but recently he broke his back. He fell from a height and his back broke, and he can't take any pain medicine. He's not able to because the potential to go back on drugs is very, very high for him. And so he's able to use CBD from marijuana, and it helps to alleviate most of his pain, which is fine, and there is no change in neurotransmitter levels. Now, I'll tell you, you'll see it when you're working in the emergency rooms. You'll see it, and you'll know your patients who are smoking marijuana, because they will just be stupid. I'm telling you. I'm not kidding you. You will know the difference between your patients who come in and they're smoking methamphetamine, or they're doing crack, or they're smoking marijuana. Because marijuana makes you dumb. And I've interacted with a lot of people who smoke marijuana, okay? Peace out. I grew up in San Francisco, okay? And let me tell you, there's a lot of people up there who do that. And over time, they just become very, very dumb people. They have a very difficult time functioning. And I have a very dear friend. I've known her since kindergarten, so a long time. And she started about 10 years ago. She decided she was going to start smoking marijuana just because, just because. And you can just see her IQ has just severely plummeted. Love her dearly, but she has become dumb. And it's really, really sad. Really sad. So you're going to see that this does have long-term effects on your patients. No matter what all the drug dealers want you to believe, it does have long-term effects. There are some benefits. They do make CBD oils. It does seem to help with arthritis. It does seem to help with epilepsy. But remember, this oil is a fat. And we already know that fats help with epilepsy. So whether taking marijuana oil is going to really help them, or any kind of oil would help them, we don't know yet. But there's going to be a lot more studies on marijuana. And you're going to see, as they come out, they're not going to be positive. They're going to be more and more negative, because now that it has become legal in California, scientists are allowed to get it and actually study it. So they've not been allowed to do that before. Even as a scientist, you could not legally possess marijuana even if it was for a scientific study. But now you can, and so you're going to see a lot of studies coming out showing the negative effects of this drug. It just hasn't been there, so we can't really talk about it as much. You just see it more on the street if you work the streets. And you'll see it a lot in the emergency room when they come in to try to get their other drugs from you.
That's true.
Because you'll become a pharmaceutical expert in the ER, because they come in and get their drugs every week.
I have a son who, after his dad died, he had trouble with anxiety, and he broke his collarbone, and he got addicted to the pain medicine, went from there to heroin, but he ended up getting off of the heroin, but went to marijuana.
Okay.
And so I've been trying to talk him into getting off of marijuana. Well, now he's interested in the CBD, is that what it is?
Correct.
Would that help with
Yes.
his anxiety?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it would. Yeah. But without affecting the brain chemistry.
Okay.
Yep. So that is the good thing. Any other questions?
I have a question. You mentioned that the cell body wouldn't be able to produce any more neurotransmitters if they were either long-term drug users or if they were long-term, like Ssri users. Do you think it's possible if they stopped those medications and then, or drugs, and then started increasing their fat intake, do you think it's possible that it could start to regenerate?
It will help. It will help. Now, whether they will go back to totally normal or not, do not know. Really.
What did you ask?
If they come off of something like an SSRI, if they've been on long term, we know that their ability to make neurotransmitter plummets. So if they go back to, let's say, eating a ketogenic diet, more fat in their diet, could they go back to normal levels of neurotransmitter? Don't know. It's probably their best bet. But whether it goes totally back to normal, but you've got to have more than just the fat in the diet. You've got to have a change in direction in the life. You've got to do a lot of different things to really bring that neurotransmitter level back up. Any other questions? Okay, so one more thing I want to show you. Some neurons, as you well know, have myelin around them. So as we've been talking with this neuron, it really isn't myelinated. But if it has myelin around it, okay, let's say from Schwann cells, you have regions on this axon that are not covered with myelin.
Do you want all this information in the essay?
No, this is not part of the essay. We're done after those three things and removing the neurotransmitter, we're done with our essay. So no, everything we've talked about since then, not part of it. So this area here would just represent the myelin going around it. But then we have bare axon here, which voltage regulated gates would be in this region. Underneath the myelin, there are no voltage regulated gates. Okay? So when our original sodium diffuses in and repels the potassium, our potassium will always accumulate in a region where there's no myelin. And so we have an action potential here. Then our sodium diffuses in and would repel our potassium again to this region where there's no myelin. So we would skip and have another action potential here. Sodium would diffuse in, and we'd repel our potassium to the next area where there's no myelin, and you have a third action, or another action potential here. Instead of having to have action potentials all the way down, you're skipping, you're jumping to all those areas where there's no myelin so that you can have more rapid movement of action potentials.
So you said because there's different codes, does that mean there's different amounts of myelin sheaths that could be on the thing?
You know, I don't know the answer to that, but boy, that would be really interesting. I don't really know.
What do you mean with
Different codes of action potentials.
Yeah.
Like Morse code. Could be. I don't know. I've never had that question before, so I'm not really sure. Huh. Very interesting. Now, what happens in like multiple sclerosis, for instance, that I showed you the video yesterday, the person's own immune system will start to eat away the myelin. So you now have an area where there's no myelin. And so instead of jumping, okay, with action potentials very rapidly down the line, now this region has no myelin, so now I have to have more action potentials here, and the information slows down. And eventually all the myelin is gone, okay? And the inflammation slows down even further. Now, one of the other things that happens for them too is in this area where there used to be myelin, the voltage regulated gates also start to disappear. So over time, the voltage regulated gates aren't even there, so they won't even be able to have action potentials where the myelin used to be. So as soon as that myelin is gone, then this area would stop having action potentials. And now, you know, they could be walking down the street and all of a sudden their leg won't move because there's no more action potentials going to it. It just stops. Now sometimes what happens is they'll have periods where all of a sudden they can start walking again because it appears that the neuron is able to build more of those voltage regulated gates again, and then they'll disappear. And then it'll try to build them again, and then they'll disappear. And over time, their abilities to walk or to move or to do different things starts to decrease more and more. So one of the things we have to do for these patients is give them pretty strong immunosuppressant drugs so that their immune system doesn't keep attacking their myelin and they can keep walking and breathing. One of the big deals is the neurons going to the respiratory muscles are myelinated. And so you want to make sure that those are working. Any questions? Yeah.
So, do neurons ever remake myelin sheaths, or are Schwann cells actual like independent cells, or is it just like a deposit from the
They're independent cells.
Okay.
Yes. They can remake the myelin, but if the immune system keeps attacking and attacking and attacking, eventually the Schwann cell dies. And then you're done. So you try to stop the attack as soon as you know the person has this disease.